Welcome to Green Tea with D-Man, Episode 1.5, Antonio Salazar, The New State. Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we get into this week's episode, let me cover some administrative items here. Firstly, a million thanks go out to the Antonio de Oliveira Salazar Facebook group for their contributions to this week's episode and to the material we will have going forward. This group is a Portuguese community dedicated to the study of Dr. Antonio Salazar, and there are some members who lived in Portugal during the years of the Estado Novo, from 1932 until 1968 under Salazar, and then until 1974 under Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano, before the Carnation Revolution completely flipped the script on politics in that country. Clearly, having input from individuals who lived through these events, as we were talking about, has much more weight than my own opinions, and I am appreciative of their time and their contributions. Secondly, we have eclipsed 100 listeners here in the first month of our series, and I want to thank all of you for taking out the time to listen. In order to grow the community, I ask that you continue discussing the podcast with friends and family, and feel free to reach out to me via email at contact@greenteawithdman.com. Thirdly, this episode is going to change in format from those prior. While we have charted a chronological course in the last several episodes, this one will go from topic to topic and cover the information and details within those blocks. Today we will start with the backdrop and then details of the 1933 Constitution, which ushered in the Estado Novo, or New State. From there we will cover the political structure of the new government and then talk about Salazar's implementation of corporatism in the country. So with all of that covered, let's get into it. We left off last time with Prime Minister Domingues Oliveira resigning in June of 1932, and within a few weeks, President Carmona had picked Antonio Salazar to head up a new cabinet. Salazar did his best to include a diverse group within the cabinet. As we have demonstrated before, he was much different than the authoritarian rulers he is so frequently compared to, those being Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, etc. Well, in early 1932, before Prime Minister Domingues Oliveira resigned, Salazar had gathered a few of his old friends and trusted colleagues, such as Domingos Fezes Vital from Coimbra, and went to work drafting a new constitution. Now remember, Portugal was still tied to the 1911 constitution, which had been implemented by the Republicans after the abdication of King Manuel II. We already discussed the unsavory situation of the Republican system from 1911 until its overthrow in the May 1926 coup by General Gomes da Costa. 45 governments in just 16 years? So let's not go back to that mess. In May, after writing up the draft constitution, Salazar and his cabinet then presented the draft for public consumption and review. Several minor changes were made to the document before it was put to national plebiscite on March 19, 1933. Official results on the vote came back as 95% approved the Constitution. Now, critics like to claim that the Constitution was railroaded through and that the government tampered with votes by assigning a proportion of abstentions to the yes category, but there's never been evidence of this, just accusations. Historian Hugh Kay presents the most likely scenario is that since the vote on the Constitution was a full package deal, i.e., the populace could not vote on the individual articles, of which there were 142 articles, or clauses within the Constitution, they had to either approve the whole thing or reject the whole thing. It is possible that a segment of the population was wary of going to the polls after what they had experienced during the Republican years, but then why would they turn out in such numbers not only for this vote, but also the one held for presidential election in 1934? Anyways, the total numbers came out as such. Yes votes counted for 719,364. Total no votes were 5,955, and the total number of abstentions came to 488,840 for a grand total of 1,214,159. With the Constitution came a new framework for the nation to be guided, and one of the major highlights was that the Estado Novo was declared a unitary and corporative republic. Now what does that even mean? In the United States, we have what is called a pluralist system, where a bunch of different groups with different governments, such as local, state, federal, who are thrown in the pot together and it's a system where we, essentially, try to outdo one another. Now, in a unitary system, such as the Estado Novo, it was recognized that the nation had a single culture, and that the people of the nation were a single entity. Within this construct, the different branches of government, such as the head of state, the National Assembly, and judicial courts, were largely combined into a hierarchical structure. By adding the corporative part, it's revealed that Antonio Salazar was creating an organic nation with class cooperation and where issues or disagreements were to be solved like a family would, that is, together at a round table as opposed to a pluralist system where groups sit at opposite ends and negotiate who gets what. As mentioned last episode, there was a heavy dose of influence from the papal encyclicals by Pope Leo XIII, as well as major influence from Charles Maurras and Gustave Le Bon in the new constitution. Despite creating a new state, hence the name Estado Novo, the 1933 Constitution kind of preserved some of the Republican principles, and the document was largely seen as a compromise with the conservative Republicans. With that said, Salazar and the National Political Council drew it up so as to weaken the liberal principles and ended up strengthening the authoritarian elements as later decrees and revisions would show in the 1930s, but this was done to tackle the changing climate of the world's economic and political situations during this turbulent time. One of the main elements Salazar eliminated was Parliament. An avowed anti-parliamentarian, Salazar said of his experience after first being elected to Parliament, "The truth is that I am profoundly anti-parliamentarian. I hate the speeches, the verbosity, the flowery, meaningless interpellations, the way we waste passion, not around any great idea, but just around futilities, nothingness from the point of view of the national good." Now, I will conduct a reading of the entire 1933 Constitution in 2 supplemental episodes, which will be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So for now, let's move on to the political structure in the new state. As I just mentioned, the new system involved an elimination of the Portuguese Parliament as it existed with a Chamber of Deputies and Senate. In its stead was an elected body of 90 members known as the National Assembly. For the first time ever in Portuguese history, women were allowed to serve in a representative manner, and on November 22, 1934, the first 3 women were elected to serve in the National Assembly. This is the first 3 women ever elected in Portugal. In addition, the Constitution expanded voting rights to a larger proportion of women than did the 1911 Constitution. The role of the National Assembly was largely to act as a legislative check to executive power, but it could also work in tandem with the President of the Council. The Assembly was to meet 3 months out of the year and consisted of 90 elected members from a list put forth by the National Union Party. It took just one session of the National Assembly before Salazar had to check the body due to its individualism after many deputies chose to take independent paths in promoting their own preferential bills. While Antonio Costa Pinto calls Salazar's regime a constitutionalized dictatorship, there was a mechanism for the National Assembly to pass a law even if Salazar or whoever was president of the council was opposed to it. If the Assembly forwarded a bill and it was vetoed by the Prime Minister, the Assembly could then bring the bill back up to a vote, and if it passed with 2/3 support, it would become law. In addition, while the Constitution provided for the government to pass decree laws at will for the 9 months out of the year when the National Assembly was not in session, those decrees had to come through the Assembly during its next meeting in order to be ratified. Along with the National Assembly was the corporative chamber, which acted in a subsidiary role. This body acted more as a consultative technocratic function and was composed of representatives of local autonomous bodies, municipalities, the administration, and of economic and social interest groups such as industry, agriculture, commercial, financial, cultural, and religious interests. While the chamber was to sit with the National Assembly during its 3-month session each year, it was also given leeway to consult the government the remaining 9 months of the year, and as the corporative system was gradually implemented, it would assume a larger and more direct role in passing legislation. Some commentators believe the goal was for the chamber to eventually replace the Assembly, but Michael Derrick believed that they would more or less switch as the chamber gained maturity and a routine in the corporative system. Derrick claims that Salazar had intended to eventually give way to an organic democracy, But historian Hugh Kay points out how the Constitution in Article 71 did not include the chamber as one of the nation's representative bodies. Alas, we may never know, as the international situation during the 1930s, the power of the military and large landowners, and then the disaster of World War II, forced Salazar's hands in many respects. Above the National Assembly and corporative chamber sat the Council of Ministers, which represented the government's cabinet ministries, as well as the Prime Minister, who was the president of the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister answered only to the President of the Republic, during this time President Carmona, but other than that, he had major latitude to direct the country and to appoint or dismiss ministers as he saw fit. It's interesting to note, President Carmona could have dismissed Prime Minister Salazar at any time, courtesy of 1. His constitutional powers, and 2. his command of the army, which was beginning to see an increasing number of officers leaning towards the rising popularity of Raul Preto and his movement, which was increasingly at odds with Salazar until their ban and exile in the mid-1930s. In practice, Salazar was not a one-man show in that he used the state machinery, such as the Assembly and his cabinet, as a soundboard for his policies. In some cases, Salazar made sure to include a cabinet consensus on state policies, and he even allowed steep criticism from his ministers, so long as they delivered it privately. One of the complaints from pro-fascists and pro-authoritarians is that Salazar's progress in Portugal was slow, and his method was not like true fascism, such as how the state machine played out with Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. Salazar addressed this line of complaint in August 1935, saying, "Mussolini and Hitler do not work like me. They do not do what I am forced to do. Governing rich countries with great resources at their disposal, they do not lack trained elites, made up of competent experts, who relieve them of all duties bar strategic tasks. I have to dedicate day and night, with no pauses, to the most different matters, carrying out tasks which I should never have to worry about." In 1934, a corporative council was established to appoint the administration's representatives to the corporative chamber. In addition, it was responsible for appointing representatives of the bodies which had yet to complete their corporative organization. This council also served in an advisory role to Prime Minister Salazar. From here, the next level was the President of the Republic, who was advised by the Council of State, which included the Prime Minister, Presidents of the National Assembly, the Corporative Chamber, and the Supreme Court of Justice, along with 5 public men of outstanding ability who served for life. The President of the Republic was elected by direct suffrage and served for terms of 7 years, with unrestricted eligibility to run, that is, no term limits. In addition, this head of state could dismiss anyone at will, to include the entire National Assembly, any member of the Council, and the Prime Minister himself. According to that, it sounded like the President of the Republic had a lot of power, but then in Article 82, the Constitution mentioned that the acts of the President of the Republic must be countersigned by the Prime Minister. As practice would show over the next 2 decades until Carmona's death in 1951, Salazar had a pretty strong hand in his dealings with the old general. With the political structure laid out, we can move into the next item, corporatism. In the U.S., there is a gross misconception and outright ignorance on what corporatism actually is. If you peruse any libertarian websites or social media pages, you will most likely eventually come across the meme showing Benito Mussolini, which says, "Fascism should more properly be called corporatism, since it is the merger of state and corporate power." Now, a few things are wrong with this quote. Firstly, it appears Mussolini never actually said this. The first time in history that it showed up appears to have been, where else, the internet, way back in 1998, which is a whopping 53 years after Mussolini was executed by communist partisans. Secondly, it shows ignorance on the part of what corporatism is. We hear the word corporate in there, and assume it must mean the uber-rich controlling the strings of power, but that simply isn't the case. Corporatism is based on the Latin word corpus, meaning body, and in this context has to do with an organic nation which seeks to do away with class struggle, opposite of communism and capitalism. One of the ways this has been done in corporatist systems was by banning both strikes and lockouts. Corporatism has been around for centuries, as it in some ways originally took the form of the medieval guild structure. In the late 1800s, it gained popularity and made a strong showing in the nations of Austria, Italy, Germany, and Portugal. Each nation developed their version in their own unique way due to local culture and traditions, as well as circumstances. The man given the task of working with Salazar to implement the Portuguese brand of corporatism was former Lusitanian integralist member Pedro Teotonio Pereira. After much consultation between Salazar, Pereira, and ex-integralists, the first step towards implementing the new structure was through the Estado de Trabalho Nacional, or the National Statute of Labor. And I apologize for just butchering those words. Anywho, this was the nation's labor charter, and had many similarities to Italy's labor charter of 1927, but it lacked the punch of its Italian companion. Why? Well, as one historian framed it, Salazar could simply not allow the corporative structure to become a power in its own right. One of Salazar's major faults, and one we will come back to over and over, and which ultimately, I think, led to the isolation of Portugal in the 1960s, was his inability to accept that anyone but him could guide the nation, and this would lead to failed policies and what many view as lost opportunities in the field of a para-fascist development. As of now, I would like to do a supplemental episode just on the National Labor Statute, but unfortunately, I have not been able to dig any up. I've found sections of the document, but nothing in the entirety, and the few parts that I have come across were in Portuguese, which were also in a format unfitting for a mass translation. So, if you happen to have a copy or know where I could find the entire labor statute, please let me know at contact@greenteawithdman.com. So, the idea was that the government would direct the national economy from above, whilst guaranteeing private property and private businesses to come together in gremios, or guilds. Workers and employers would equally represent the corporation or sector. This meant that workers chose their representatives, and the employers chose theirs to represent, say, heavy industry. These combined representatives made up into different federations with other similar economic or social interests. From these unions, as they were known, representatives were then chosen for the corporative chamber. Remember, we just talked about that a couple of minutes ago. Employers were barred from locking out their workers, and workers were barred from striking, as both actions undermined the national economy and the well-being of the national good. In addition, collective labor contracts were negotiated by the workers' syndicates and the employers' guilds. But if they failed to reach an agreement, then the government could step in and arbitrate a solution. Once this solution was agreed upon, both parties were bound to the agreement, or else the state would force the conditions through its own power. Salazar viewed it in such a way that the welfare of the collective transcended and included the individual, since the individual exists socially as a member of a group, whether it be family, profession, and or community. Originally, progress was slow due to established interests, such as the large landowners in the Alentejo, which was the rich southern agricultural center. Eventually, new corporations were created in the 1950s after consolidation of the commercial and industrial bodies. In order to establish this structure, though, independent trade unions had to be destroyed, and the state was effective in achieving this. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, there were influential and powerful interests, such as those in the Alentejo, which undermined the system by diluting or outright eliminating the interests of its workers. In 1935, laws were passed aiming to build out and support social welfare, including a minimum wage, and expectations were high that new corporations would be next on the agenda. However, this was not to be for another 20 years, as I mentioned a minute ago. Much to the dismay of Pedro Pereira, some employers simply ignored the laws requiring them to pay their workers a minimum wage, or to limit the working hours of their employees. Seeing the large and wealthy economic interests getting away with mistreating the workers infuriated Pereira to the point of submitting his resignation, which he did several times, before Salazar finally removed him due to pressure from those same economic interest groups. In essence, Salazar was backing down to the wealthy and powerful businessmen, thereby preserving their position whilst they continued to back him. And I think it's kind of a black mark on Salazar's record, because he probably could have done more to support the working class, but we will never know. Because while hindsight is 20/20 and we are looking at this 80 years later, during that time there was no guarantee that Prime Minister Salazar would remain in power, so he played the cards he was dealt. And this is going to be one of several themes as we go through the series, the kind of what could have been, if these leaders had done this instead of that, or if World War II had not happened, or if the Axis had won. Nonetheless, this move caused friction with the fascists and his administration, who wished to see the new state enforce its laws regarding protection of the working class. Yes, you heard that right. Fascism is an ideology that is supposed to care for workers, and it's something we will return to a few times during the course of our entire first series of leaders over the next year or so. Now, it's here that I will end this week's episode. If you're familiar with Antonio Salazar and the Estado Novo already, then you probably noticed I did not really go into too much detail about the National Union, or that I left out the Portuguese Legion and the Portuguese Youth Movement, and that is a correct observation to have been made. I plan on having a supplemental episode dedicated to the party structure, which will come after episodes 1.5a and 1.5b, which will be a reading of the two sections of the Constitution. Had I continued on, we could have gone down a rabbit hole with this episode that would have ended up taking far too long. Episode 1.5c will break down those three movements within the Estado Novo before we get to Relao Preto and his National Syndicalist movement and the communist opposition on the Iberian Peninsula. So with that, I thank you for tuning in this week and hope to see you next week. This is Green Tea with D-Man.